The smoke has finally cleared, but the distinct acrid smell of burning cedar and roasted meat still clings to the cracked stones of the beach, a heavy scent that hangs low in the stagnant air of the late afternoon. The screaming stopped hours ago, replaced by a silence so profound and heavy that it feels like a physical weight pressing against your chest. A silence that usually only comes after the world has been irrevocably broken. We are standing on the shores of what was once a great city, but now the walls are blackened teeth jutting into a grey sky, and the surf that laps against the sand is stained with a dark, iron-rich foam that speaks of what flowed into the water. This is not the clean white marble ruin of a museum. It is a raw wound in the earth, the messy, chaotic aftermath of 10 years of waiting and one night of absolute devastation. The seagulls are the only things moving now, circling in lazy, white loops above the wreckage, indifferent to the empire that has just been erased beneath them, their cries sounding strangely like mocking laughter in the quiet. This is the moment when the adrenaline fades and the horror sets in. When the survivors look at their hands and realize that the blood will never truly wash off, and the heroes they worshipped are revealed to be something far more terrifying than the monsters they fought. Close your eyes now and let the darkness of this ancient beach wrap around you, shielding you from the harsh glare of the present day, and let yourself drift back 3,000 years to a time when the gods were cruel, the bronze was sharp, and the line between a man and a beast was razor thin. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. We are here to walk through the ashes of the Bronze Age, to find the truth buried beneath the poets' songs and the golden armor of Hollywood legends. We are here to find Achilles. But the man we are looking for is not the golden-haired champion you might remember from the movies, the noble warrior who fights for love and glory with a clean heart and a square jaw. That image is a ghost, a polite fiction created by centuries of storytellers who wanted to hide the brutal reality of what it takes to be the greatest killer who ever lived. The real Achilles, the one who walked these bloody sands and whose name made kings tremble in their fortified palaces, was a figure of cosmic horror, a man who stripped away his own humanity piece by piece until there was nothing left but a void where a soul should be. To understand him, we must look past the shining surface and see the darkness that fueled him, a darkness that was forged long before he ever set foot on the plains of Troy. In the ancient world, glory was not a polite applause. It was a hungry thing, a beast that demanded to be fed, and Achilles was its most devoted servant. We often think of the Iliad as a story of heroism, a grand adventure of spears and shields. But if you listen closely to the ancient Greek, it does not begin with a word for war, or honor, or courage. It begins with the word menin, rage. A rage so specific, so consuming, and so devastating that it is usually reserved only for the gods, a divine fury that burns everything it touches. This is the story of that rage, not as a glorious fire, but as a cold, suffocating smoke that choked the life out of an entire generation. As we drift through this narrative, we must peel back the layers of romanticism that have accumulated over the millennia like barnacles on a ship's hull. We have to forget the romantic paintings of the Renaissance, where Achilles looks like a brooding philosopher in silk robes. We must place him back in the late Bronze Age, a world of heavy, dented metal and blunt force, a world where life was short, brutal, and often ended in the mud. It was a time when the sky was vast and terrifying, filled with gods who were not benevolent parents, but petty tyrants who played with human lives like bored children with a box of toys. In this world, Achilles was not a superhero saving the day. He was a weapon of mass destruction with the emotional maturity of a stunted child, a biological machine designed for slaughter, who found himself trapped in a human body that was too small to contain his wrath. Historians still argue whether the Trojan War was a single event or a conflation of many raids and sieges over centuries. But for our journey tonight, the archaeological timeline matters less than the psychological truth of the man at the center of the storm. We are looking for the human cost of being a legend. Imagine the pressure of being told from birth that you are better than everyone else, that you are destined for greatness, but that the price of that greatness is your life. Imagine knowing that every breath you take is a countdown, that you have been given a choice between a long, quiet, forgotten life or a short, violent explosion of fame that will echo forever. Most of us would choose the quiet life, the comfort of family, the warmth of a hearth, the gentle slide into old age. But Achilles chose the explosion. He chose to burn. And tonight, we are going to watch that burning, not with judgment, but with the quiet observation of ghosts witnessing a tragedy that we are powerless to stop. The air here on the beach is cooling now as the sun dips below the horizon, casting long, purple shadows across the ruins of the Greek camp. You can hear the distant murmur of the Myrmidons, his elite soldiers, men who moved with a hive-mind discipline that terrified their enemies. They are cleaning their weapons, scraping the gore from their bronze spear tips, their movements efficient and cold. They do not sing songs of victory tonight. They know that their leader is not a man who celebrates. He is a man who consumes. The popular image of Achilles is often depicted in modern media as a golden, noble hero, a soldier's soldier who respects his enemy and loves his friends. This is a far cry from the terrifying reality found in the ancient texts. The real story of Achilles is not one of gallantry, but of human sacrifice, of a mother's desperate cruelty, and the systematic deconstruction of a man's capacity to feel love. To understand Achilles is to look past the shining hero and see a war criminal who chose a short, blood-soaked life of eternal glory over the quiet dignity of simply being human. It is a tragedy of wasted potential, of a man who had the power to be anything he wanted, but who was molded by his parents and his culture into a creature that could only destroy. As the night deepens and the stars begin to prick the velvet sky above the Aegean Sea, we can almost see the ghost of him walking by the water, brooding, separate from the others. He is alone, even among his own army. He carries a heaviness that no armor can explain. This is where our story truly begins, not on the battlefield, but in the dark, silent places where a boy was turned into a monster. We must go back to the beginning, before the war, before the ships, before the armor. We must go back to a hearth in a palace where a fire is burning and a mother is making a terrible mistake in the name of love. The waves gently lap at the shore, a rhythmic, hypnotic sound that mimics the heartbeat of a sleeping giant, pulling us deeper into the past, away from the safety of our beds, and into the flickering torchlight of a Bronze Age palace where a baby is crying. The sound is muffled, distant, but distinct. It is the sound of a child who is learning, far too early, that the world is a place of pain. The wind shifts, blowing the smoke away, and for a moment, the moon breaks through the clouds, illuminating the path backward in time. We are drifting now, leaving the ruins of Troy behind, floating across the sea to the rugged mountains of Pythia, to the home of a king and a goddess who could not agree on what their son should be. The silence here is different. It is not the silence of death, but the silence of anticipation, the holding of breath before the scream. It is a domestic scene, quiet and intimate, yet shadowed by a looming dread. We are entering the nursery of a nightmare, the place where the weapon was forged. The temperature drops and the shadows lengthen. We are no longer observers of the aftermath. We are witnesses to the origin. The story of Achilles is not just about how he died or who he killed. It is about how he was made. And the making of him was a brutal, searing process that left scars on his soul that no divine armor could ever cover. So let the sound of the waves fade into the crackle of a fire, the warm, dangerous snap of burning wood. We are safe here, watching from the shadows. But he was not. He was never safe. The fire in the hearth is not a source of comfort tonight. It is a living, breathing entity, a hungry mouth glowing with a terrifying, pulsating orange light in the center of the dark palace room. The shadows dance violently against the stone walls, mimicking the flickering unease that permeates this household. A home built on the uneasy truce between a mortal king and an immortal goddess. We are told, in the playgrounds of our childhood and the simplified storybooks of later years, that Achilles was made invulnerable by water. The image is iconic. A mother gripping her infant by the heel, dipping him into the black, freezing currents of the river Styx, sealing his skin against blades and arrows, leaving only that one small, fatal spot dry and vulnerable. It is a clean, almost baptismal image, easy to understand and easy to forgive. But that is the Roman version of the story, a later retelling by the poet Statius, written nearly 1,000 years after the Bronze Age collapsed, a sanitized remix for a gentler audience. The original Greek myth, the one whispered with a shudder by the people who actually worshipped these terrifying gods, is far darker. It does not involve cold water. It involves fire. It involves the smell of singing hair and the muffled cries of a confused child. The truth is that Thetis, the sea goddess mother of Achilles, did not just want to protect her son, she wanted to rewrite his biology. She despised the mortality she saw in him, the frailty inherited from his father, Peleus. To her, his human blood was a defect, a sickness that needed to be purged. And so in the dead of night, while the palace slept and the wind howled outside like a warning, she would take the infant Achilles from his cradle. She did not sing lullabies. She did not rock him. With a face as impassive as a marble statue, she would carry him to the great hearth in the center of the hall, where the embers were raked into a bed of glowing red heat. This was not an act of murder, at least not in her mind. It was a divine surgery. She was attempting to burn away the mortal half of his soul, to forge him like a piece of iron, turning flesh into something eternal. Night after night, she buried her son in the fire. Imagine the confusion of the infant. The person who is supposed to be his source of safety, his source of nourishment and love, is the same person who places him into the heat. He learns, before he can even speak, that love is not a soft touch or a warm embrace. He learns that love is pain. He learns that to be special, to be worthy of his mother's attention, he must endure burning. He must withstand the heat that would kill a normal child. It is a psychological conditioning that no amount of therapy could ever undo. He is being taught that his natural state, his humanity, is something to be ashamed of, something to be destroyed. Historians still argue whether this myth reflects an ancient, misunderstood practice of infant fever management, or a symbolic memory of child sacrifice rituals from the darker corners of Mycenaean religion. But the narrative effect is the same. Achilles was a survivor of domestic abuse long before he was a survivor of war. The ritual only ended because of a mistake. One night, King Peleus, perhaps stirred by the strange silence or a father's intuition, woke and walked into the great hall. He saw his wife holding their son in the flames. He did not see a goddess purifying a demigod. He saw a mother incinerating their child. He screamed, a raw human sound of terror that shattered the spell, and snatched the boy from the fire. Thetis, furious at being interrupted, furious that her work was left unfinished, dropped the child and fled back to the sea, abandoning them both. She left Achilles with a burned ankle, the one part she hadn't finished tempering, and a shattered psyche. Peleus saved his son's life, but the damage was already done. The boy had absorbed the lesson into his very marrow. He was incomplete. He was half god, half human, and the human half was a failure that had caused his mother to leave. This rejection formed the bedrock of his personality. It created a void, a desperate need for validation that would eventually drive him to the walls of Troy. He wasn't fighting for a flag or a king. He was fighting to prove that he was more than the mortal mistake his mother had tried to burn away. The palace of Phthia, once a home, became a hollow shell without the goddess. Peleus, an aging king with a traumatized son, realized he was unequipped to raise a boy with such a volatile nature. The child was fierce, prone to sudden, terrifying outbursts of temper, likely a manifestation of the trauma he had endured. He was too much for the servants, too much for the tutors, too much for a father who just wanted a normal heir. The air in the palace grew stifling, heavy with the weight of the mother's absence and the son's growing, restless energy. Achilles was a wild thing trapped indoors, pacing the stone floors, his eyes always scanning for a threat, or perhaps for a fire. He was a predator in the making, and predators cannot be raised in a nursery. They need the wild. And so, the decision was made to send him away. It is a common trope in hero stories. The young prince sent for a boarding school education. But in the brutal context of Greek mythology, this was not a place of books and lyres. Peleus sent him to Mount Pelion, a rugged, untamed wilderness that loomed over the landscape like a brooding giant. He was to be fostered by Chiron, the centaur. Now, we must pause and adjust our image of a centaur. Forget the whimsical, friendly creatures of fantasy novels. In Greek art, centaurs were often depicted as terrifying, liminal beings, symbols of chaos, drunkenness, and violent lust. They were the embodiment of nature's unbridled aggression. Chiron was the exception, the civilized centaur, a master of medicine and music. But he was still a creature of the wild. He was not a human teacher. He was a monster who had learned to control his instincts, and he was the only one capable of handling the boy who had been dipped in fire. The journey up the mountain was a transition from the world of men to the world of beasts. The air grew thinner, colder, smelling of pine resin and wet earth. The comforts of the palace, the soft beds, the cooked food, the servants, were left behind. Achilles was being handed over to the mountain. This was the second abandonment of his young life. First his mother, now his father. As the gates of the palace closed behind him, he must have looked back, a small figure against the vast, indifferent landscape, realizing that he was truly alone. He was being exiled to the edge of the world to learn how to be a weapon. The fire of the hearth was gone, replaced by the cold starlight of the wilderness. But the burning inside him had not stopped. It had just gone deeper, hiding behind his ribs, waiting for a wind to fan it into a blaze that would consume cities. He was no longer just a boy. He was raw material, waiting to be sharpened, and the education he was about to receive would ensure that any remaining softness in his heart would be surgically removed, not by fire this time, but by the cold, bloody reality of survival. The mountain waited for him in silence, its peaks jagged against the moon, a vast stone arena where he would learn the terrible cost of being the best. On the slopes of Mount Pelion, the air does not smell of roasted meats or perfumed oils, the comforting sense of the civilization Achilles left behind. Instead, it smells of pine resin, wet fur, and the metallic tang of old blood drying on stone. The education of the young prince did not take place in a classroom with scrolls and tablets, nor was it a gentle instruction in the arts of diplomacy or governance. It was a systematic deconstruction of his domestic habits, a rewiring of his gut and his instincts designed to ensure that the boy who survived the fire would thrive in the slaughter. Chiron, the centaur, was not merely a teacher. He was the curator of a living nightmare, a guardian of the old wild ways that existed before cities walled off the night. He looked at the boy and saw the potential for absolute devastation. But he knew that potential could only be realized if the human weakness, the desire for comfort, for cooked food, for softness, was starved out of him. And so the diet of Achilles became a thing of horror, a menu designed not to nourish a child, but to build a monster. The ancient texts are specific and unsettling on this point. Achilles was not fed the milk of goats or the bread of wheat, the staple foods that bound men to the rhythms of agriculture and peace. Instead, Chiron fed him the raw entrails of lions and the marrow of wild boars. This was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was a practice rooted in the deep, primal logic of the Bronze Age known as sympathetic magic. The belief was literal and terrifyingly simple. You are what you consume. To eat the heart of a lion is to ingest its courage. To suck the marrow from the bones of a wild boar is to absorb its unyielding, ferocious endurance. To dine on the innards of a she-wolf is to take into your blood the pack instinct and the ruthless efficiency of a hunter. Day after day, the boy was forced to tear into raw flesh, his face smeared with the life force of apex predators, swallowing their aggression until it became his own. He was ingesting the very essence of violence. Historians still argue whether these myths of wild diets were metaphors for the brutal initiation rites of actual Bronze Age warrior cults, where boys were exiled into the wilderness and forced to live off the land to harden them against pity, or if they reflect a specific shamanistic tradition of the Thessalian region. Regardless of the historical kernel, the psychological result described in the myth is clear. Achilles was being chemically and spiritually altered. He was being severed from the community of bread-eaters, the community of civilized men who sat at tables and broke crusts together. He was becoming something else, a biological machine fueled by the death of stronger creatures. Under Chiron's tutelage, he learned to run without stopping, his stamina becoming so legendary that he could chase down a deer on foot and catch it without the aid of dogs. This image of the boy sprinting through the underbrush, silent and fast as a shadow, closing his hands around the neck of a fleeing stag, is not an image of sport. It is an image of a predator who has transcended the need for tools. He did not need a net. He was the net. He did not need a trap. He was the trap. But there was a cost to this savage curriculum. In learning the way of the lion and the boar, Achilles missed the lessons on how to be a man among men. He learned dominance, not cooperation. He learned that the only valid response to an obstacle was to shatter it. The sympathetic magic worked too well. He absorbed the aggression of the beasts, but he also absorbed their lack of mercy. A lion does not pause to consider the feelings of the gazelle. A boar does not negotiate with the hunter. They simply act. By the time Achilles reached adolescence, his emotional maturity had been stunted, frozen at the age when his mother abandoned him, while his physical capacity for violence had grown to godlike proportions. He was an emotional toddler, trapped in the body of a killing machine. He could play the lyre, yes. Chiron taught him music to soothe the savage beast inside. But the music was a thin veneer over a core of molten rage. When he sang of the glories of heroes, which in his mind were synonymous with the glories of death. He did not understand compromise. He did not understand losing. He only understood the binary reality of the predator. You are either the eater or the eaten. As the years passed on the mountain, the boy grew into a young man, but his eyes held an unsettling vacancy, a coldness that unnerved even the other heroes who occasionally visited the centaur. He was beautiful, with the golden hair of a god, but it was the beauty of a storm cloud or a tidal wave, a terrible, awe-inspiring beauty that promised destruction. When the call for the Trojan War finally came, when the kings of Greece began to muster their armies and look for champions, they did not realize what they were recruiting. They thought they were getting a prince, a strong arm to hold a shield. But the training on Mount Pelion had produced something far more dangerous. They had not recruited a hero. They had unleashed a weapon of mass destruction. They were bringing a creature to Troy that had the face of a man, but the marrow of a monster, a being who viewed the battlefield not as a place of honor, but as a feeding ground. The ships were gathering at Aulis, 1,000 black sails waiting to cross the sea, and the world was holding its breath. But up on the mountain, the training was complete. Achilles stood on the precipice, looking down at the world of men he was about to enter, a world he was ill-equipped to understand, but perfectly designed to dismantle. He was ready to descend, not to save the Greeks, but to burn his name into the bedrock of history. And as he walked down the mountain path, leaving the centaur and the wild behind, he carried with him the heavy, silent promise of the violence to come, a violence that would require tools as heavy and unforgiving as the heart that now beat in his chest. The time for raw meat was over. The time for iron and ash had begun. He descends from the high, thin air of the mountain into the heavy, sweltering heat of the plains, bringing with him a piece of the wild that never leaves his hand. In the modern imagination, we often picture the heroes of the Trojan War fighting like fencing masters, dancing with light, agile blades, their movements choreographed like a ballet of steel. But the reality of the late Bronze Age was a world of crushing weight, a world where men strapped sheets of hammered bronze to their chests and shins until they resembled walking tanks, sweating and gasping in the Mediterranean sun. To understand the violence of Achilles, you must first understand the sheer physical burden of his existence. He did not step onto the battlefield to fence. He stepped onto it to demolish. The tool of his trade was not a sword, though he carried one. It was the Pelian ash spear, a weapon so legendary and so terrifyingly heavy that it occupies a category of its own in the ancient texts. This was not a standard-issue military pike. It was a massive beam of timber, hewn from the highest ridges of Mount Pelion by Chiron himself, a tree trunk that had withstood centuries of storms before it was straightened and tipped with a cruel leaf-shaped bronze point. The wood retained the density of the mountain, a heavy, unyielding memory of the forest that no ordinary man could master. The myths are specific and repetitive on this detail. In the entire Greek army, filled with men like the giant Ajax and the wily Odysseus, not a single one of them could even lift Achilles' spear, let alone throw it. It was a weapon exclusive to him, a physical extension of his own isolation. When he held it, he was holding the mountain. He was holding the wild upbringing that made him separate from other men. Imagine the physics of this weapon in motion. In the hands of a normal man, a spear is a tool for poking, for keeping an enemy at bay. In the hands of Achilles, the Pelion ash was a kinetic event. He did not rely on the finesse of a wrist flick. He utilized the raw, explosive power of his predator-fed muscles to launch a heavy projectile that generated force equations the human body was not designed to survive. When that spear hit a shield, it did not just pierce the leather and bronze, it shattered the arm bone beneath it. It punched through breastplates like a battering ram carrying the momentum of a falling tree. The sound of Achilles on the battlefield was not the ring of metal on metal. It was the wet, sickening crunch of collapse. He fought with a brutality that mirrored the lessons of the centaur, direct, overwhelming, and devoid of hesitation. He understood that in a world of heavy armor, the only way to win was to generate enough energy to traumatize the organs inside the shell. He was a master of blunt force trauma, delivered with a piercing edge. This reliance on superior equipment and supernatural strength points to a different kind of warrior ethos, one that is less about fair play and more about the industrial efficiency of killing. The armor he wore, even before the divine set forged by Hephaestus later in the war, was likely a masterpiece of Mycenaean craftsmanship. Heavy plates of bronze laid over leather, perhaps resembling the famous Dendra panoply found by archaeologists, which turns a man into an articulated lobster of metal. Moving in this gear required immense stamina, the kind only a man raised on lion intestines could possess. While other men tired after an hour of hacking and shoving in the dust, their lungs burning from the heat trapped inside their helmets, Achilles was just getting started. His endurance was his second weapon. He could fight at maximum output while his enemies were gasping for air, their movements slowing, their shields drooping. He was the storm that never blew itself out. Historians still argue whether the descriptions of single combat in the Iliad reflect a poetic convention or a genuine memory of Bronze Age champion warfare, where battles were decided by the clash of warlords while the armies watched. But within the narrative of Achilles, the duel is the only stage that matters. It is the place where the heavy metal reality of his life is most visible. He is not a general who stands in the back, pointing. He is the tip of the spear, literally and metaphorically. The violence he inflicts is described with an anatomical precision that suggests the oral poets knew exactly what a heavy bronze spear does to a human body. It enters the jaw and exits the nape of the neck. It shears through tendons. It bursts eyeballs. These are not glorious deaths. They are gruesome industrial accidents caused by a man who is operating on a different physical plane. The terror he inspired was not just fear of death. It was the fear of being unmade. To face Achilles was to face a natural disaster wrapped in bronze. Yet there is a strange intimacy to this weapon. The spear was a gift from Chiron to Peleus, and then to Achilles. It is an heirloom of the violent lineage he cannot escape. Every time he grips the rough wood of the shaft, he is shaking hands with his father and his teacher, the two male figures who shaped him into a killer. It is a burden he carries willingly, a reminder that his power comes from the past, from the wild, and from the expectations placed upon him. He cannot put it down. To put down the spear would be to put down his identity. In the quiet moments between battles, when the camp is asleep and the fires have burned down to embers, one can imagine him sitting in his tent, polishing the bronze tip, running a whetstone along the edge with a rhythmic scraping sound. Shh, clack, shh, clack, the sound of a predator sharpening its claws. He does not look at the spear with affection, but with a cold, professional respect. It is the only thing in the world that does not break when he uses it. It is the only thing that can handle his rage. The rest of the Greek army looks at him with a mixture of awe and revulsion. They see the way he moves, the way the heavy timber rests lightly in his hand, as if it were a reed. They know that he is not like them. They are men of farms and families, men who want to go home. He is a man of the spear, a man who is only truly alive when he is ending the lives of others. The weight of the weapon separates him from humanity just as much as his mother's fire did. He is anchored to the earth by the heaviness of his tools, unable to float away into the normal, light concerns of life. And behind him, always, stands the only group of men who can keep pace with him, the only ones who understand the language of heavy metal and silence. They are waiting in the shadows of the ships, their own armor dull and scarred, their eyes fixed on his back. They are not just soldiers, they are a pack. And as Achilles lifts his spear, signaling the start of another day of slaughter, they move with him, a dark tide rising to meet the moon. The weapon is ready. The man is ready. The war is not a game of strategy for him. It is a canvas, and he is about to paint it red with a brush that weighs as much as a man. Behind the singular, terrifying figure of Achilles stands a shadow that is even more unnerving because it is multiplied by thousands. The Myrmidons. If Achilles is the storm, then the Myrmidons are the dark, rising tide that follows, silent and inevitable. In the sprawling, chaotic encampment of the Greek coalition, where soldiers from dozens of different city-states shout in different dialects, gamble over stolen wine, and nurse their grudges, the Myrmidon quarter is an island of chilling order. These men are not conscripts dragged from their plows by a feudal lord. They are a professional private army, a retinue of shock troops who operate with a hive mind discipline that separates them from every other warrior on the beach. The ancient myths claim that the myrmidons were originally ants, transformed into men by Zeus to repopulate the island of Aegina after a plague. It is a strange, whimsical story on the surface, but like all myths, it encodes a psychological truth about how these men fight. They do not boast, they do not break formation. They move with the industrious, selfless, and terrifying coordination of a colony, swarming over their enemies, not as individuals seeking glory, but as a single, crushing organism. To watch them muster is to watch a biological machine click into gear. There is no shouting of orders, only the rhythmic thud of feet hitting the sand in unison, a sound that vibrates in the rib cages of their allies and enemies alike. They are the ant-men, yes, but they have the appetites of wolves, and their loyalty is not to the High King Agamemnon, but solely to the man who feeds them the war, Achilles. To understand the sheer intimidation factor of this unit, we must look closely at their gear, specifically their helmets. In the popular imagination, we see Greeks in the Corinthian helmet, that beautiful, smooth bronze dome with the T-shaped slit for the eyes and mouth. But that helmet belongs to a later age, centuries after Troy fell. The Myrmidons of the late Bronze Age wore something far more primal and grotesque, the boar's tusk helmet. Picture a cap made of thick leather, felt lined for comfort, but the exterior is not metal. It is covered in rows of curved, gleaming white plates, stitched together in alternating patterns that look like scales. These are the tusks of wild boars, sliced and polished. This is not just protective gear. It is a statistical boast of slaughter. Archaeologists estimate that to make a single helmet required the tusks of 40 to 50 boars. Now, do the math of the battlefield. If Achilles commands a force of 2,000 Myrmidons, and each man wears such a helmet, you are looking at the death of 100,000 apex predators just to dress the army. When a Trojan soldier looked across the field and saw the Myrmidons, he did not just see bronze and leather. He saw a wall of ivory teeth. He saw a unit that had already conquered nature before they even arrived to conquer the city. The psychological message was clear. We have killed the monsters of the wild. You are nothing to us. This visual terror was backed by a brutal efficiency that turned the Trojan War into a business. We often think of the war as a 10-year stare-down at the walls of Troy, a static siege where nothing happened until the wooden horse. But the reality described in the texts is one of constant, aggressive movement. Achilles and his Myrmidons did not sit idle. For 9 years, they treated the war as a piracy operation, using the beachhead at Troy as a base to ravage the surrounding coastline. Achilles himself boasts of sacking 12 cities by sea and 11 by land. These were not heroic duels. They were liquidation events. The Myrmidons would descend upon a town like Lyrnessus or Thebe, the ant-men scaling the walls and breaking the gates with their heavy shields, while Achilles led the charge. They stripped these cities of everything: gold, bronze, cattle, and people. This is where the concept of time comes into play. The tangible honor, the stuff you can hold in your hands. In the Bronze Age, your worth as a man was directly correlated to the amount of loot you possessed. Achilles was not just a warrior. He was a CEO of a corporation built on plunder. He and his myrmidons were becoming fabulously wealthy, hoarding piles of tripods and cauldrons, while the other Greek kings looked on with envy. This created a dangerous dynamic within the Greek camp. The myrmidons were the most effective unit, the ones doing the heavy lifting, the ones bringing in the resources that kept the army fed and paid. They knew they were indispensable. They walked through the camp with the swagger of men who know they are carrying the entire war effort on their backs. Yet, despite their ferocity, there is a strange, almost monastic bond between them and their leader. Achilles is not a distant general to them. He is the head of the pack. They sleep near his tent. They eat the meat he provides. There is a deep, unspoken intimacy in their shared violence. Among them walks Patroclus, the second in command, the gentle counterweight to Achilles' rage. If Achilles is the sharp edge of the sword, Patroclus is the hilt, the connection to humanity that keeps the weapon from spinning out of control. The Myrmidons love Patroclus because he remembers their names, he tends to their wounds, he treats them as men rather than ants. But they worship Achilles because he makes them gods of war. Historians still argue whether the Myrmidons represent a historical tribe from Thessaly who practiced a specific form of totemic warfare, or if they are a poetic invention designed to highlight Achilles' isolation. But in the narrative, their function is absolute. They are the extension of Achilles' body. When he rests, they rest. When he fights, they fight. And when he stops, when he decides that the war is no longer worth his time, they stop with him. This is the precipice upon which the Greek army stands, unaware of the silence that is about to swallow them. The Myrmidons are a loaded gun, and Achilles has his finger on the trigger. But he is about to engage the safety catch. The raids have been successful, the ships are heavy with gold, and the helmets of boar tusks are polished to a gleam. But the economy of the war is about to crash. The ant-men are disciplined, yes, but they are also proud. They know their worth. And when the high King Agamemnon makes the fatal mistake of disrespecting the man who leads the wolves, he will find that the Myrmidons are just as good at doing nothing as they are at killing. Imagine the scene. Thousands of the world's most dangerous soldiers, men wearing the teeth of beasts, simply sitting down in the sand, folding their arms, and watching their allies die. The weapon of mass destruction is about to go on strike. The silence of the Myrmidons, usually a prelude to an attack, will become the sound of doom for the Greeks. The wolves are going to sit by the fire and watch the sheep get slaughtered, and they will not lift a single spear to help. The machinery of the war is grinding to a halt, not because of a defeat, but because of a bruised ego. And in the center of that silence sits Achilles, playing his lyre, surrounded by his ant-men, waiting for the world to realize exactly how dark the night gets when the sun refuses to rise. The wind on the island of Syros is different from the biting gales of Phthia or the wild, pine-scented breezes of Mount Pelion. Here, the air is soft, smelling of salt and blooming jasmine, a gentle, lulling atmosphere that feels less like a kingdom and more like a dream. It is to this quiet, unsuspecting rock in the middle of the Aegean that we must follow the trail of Achilles, for it is here that the narrative takes its strangest and most psychologically complex turn. We are leaving the world of blood and bone for a moment and entering a world of silk and secrets. The war is coming. The drums are beating in Aulis. But the greatest warrior of the age is nowhere to be found among the mustering armies. He has vanished, and the reason for his disappearance lies in a prophecy that terrified even the gods. Thetis, his mother, knew the score. She had been told by the fates that her son had two paths before him. He could stay home, marry, grow old, and see his children's children eventually dying in a warm bed, forgotten by history, but loved by those who knew him. Or he could go to Troy. If he went to Troy, he would never return. He would die young, his body broken on foreign soil, but his name, his Kleos, would burn forever in the minds of men. It was the ultimate choice, a long, anonymous life or a short, glorious death. Thetis, driven by a mother's desperate instinct to preserve the breathing, living body of her son over the cold abstraction of fame, chose for him. She kidnapped him from the world of men and hid him in the court of King Lycomedes, disguised as a girl. This period of his life is often played for laughs in later comedies, a farce of a burly hero in a dress. But if we look at it through the lens of the brutal truth, it is a time of immense psychological torture. Imagine the creature we have just described, a young man raised on the marrow of lions, trained to outrun deer, his muscles coiled with the explosive energy of a predator, now forced to sit still in a harem of princesses. He was given the name Pyrrha, meaning the red one, or flame-colored, perhaps a nod to his hair, or the fire that had almost consumed him as an infant. For months, perhaps years, Achilles lived a lie that chafed against his very soul. He had to suppress every instinct he had honed on the mountain. He had to walk with small steps when his legs wanted to sprint. He had to weave wool when his hands only knew the weight of the ash spear. It was a pressure cooker situation. The wolf was not just in sheep's clothing. He was in the sheep's nursery, trying to pretend he didn't have teeth. This suppression of his nature likely fueled the explosive rage that would later define him. He was a tightly wound spring, being compressed further and further every day he spent in the fragrant, suffocating air of the women's quarters. He did find a way to break the rules, of course. He began a secret affair with the king's daughter, Deidamia, a relationship that would produce his only son, Neoptolemus. But even this was a shadow life, a stolen comfort in a prison of deception. But history has a way of finding its monsters. The Greeks, stalled at Aulis and desperate for the city sacker, prophesied to win them the war, sent their most cunning agent to find him, Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, a man who understood the human mind better than any god, suspected that Achilles was hiding in plain sight on Scyros. He did not come with an army. He came as a merchant, a peddler of fine goods. He laid out his wares in the great hall of Lycomedes, bolts of purple linen, intricate jewelry of gold and amber, perfumes from the east, all the things that would delight the princesses of a wealthy court. But in the middle of this glittering display, hidden among the trinkets with a casual, calculated negligence, he placed a magnificent shield and a spear. It was a trap designed to bypass the disguise and speak directly to the reptile brain of the warrior. The moment is cinematic in its tension. The princesses flocked to the jewelry, their hands fluttering over the gold, their voices rising in delight. But one girl stood back, eyes fixed not on the necklaces, but on the cold, dull gleam of the bronze weaponry. Achilles, the predator in the dress, felt the pull of the metal. It was magnetic. While the others held up mirrors, his hand drifted toward the grip of the sword. He could not help himself. The muscle memory of the mountain was stronger than the disguise. And then Odysseus signaled his trumpeter. A single, piercing blast of a war horn shattered the peace of the palace, a sound that signaled an imminent attack. The reaction was instantaneous and telling. The princesses screamed and fled, dropping the jewelry. But Pyrrha did not run. The girl ripped off the dress, revealing the tunic beneath, and seized the spear and shield, eyes scanning the room for the threat, the posture shifting instantly from passive to lethal. The mask had fallen. The lion was out of the cage. In that frozen moment, with the sound of the trumpet fading and the spear in his hand, Achilles made his choice. He could have laughed it off, put the weapon down, and continued the charade. But he didn't. He looked at Odysseus, and he looked at the weapon, and he knew that the hiding was over. He was choosing the short, blood-soaked life. He was accepting the death sentence. It is a profound moment of existential tragedy. He wasn't just joining an army. He was stepping onto a conveyor belt that would drop him into the grave. Historians still argue whether this episode on Scyros was a later invention designed to explain why Achilles joined the war late, or to provide a lineage for his son, or if it reflects a distorted memory of ancient cross-dressing initiation rituals where boys lived as women before being reborn as warriors. But within the story, it serves as the final seal on his fate. Thetis's attempt to save him had failed because you cannot hide a fire in a basket of wool. Eventually, it will burn through. Achilles left Scyros not with regret, but with a terrifying sense of relief. The pretense was gone. He no longer had to be Pyrrha. He could be Achilles. He gathered his myrmidons, the ships were launched, and the Red One sailed for Troy, leaving the weeping Deidamia and his unborn son behind. He was trading the possibility of a family for the certainty of a name that would be shouted for thousands of years. The soft winds of Scyros were replaced by the harsh, salt spray of the open sea, and the young man stood at the prow of his ship, staring toward the horizon where the walls of Troy waited. He was sailing toward his own death, and he was doing it with his eyes wide open. The weapon had been forged, the predator had been fed, and now the disguise had been discarded. The world was about to see exactly what Thetis had been trying to hide, and the cost of that revelation would be measured in rivers of blood. The boy was gone. The myth was beginning. The sun hangs suspended over the Trojan plain like a hammer of beaten gold, radiating a heat that shimmers off the bronze armor of the men below, baking the dust into a fine choking powder. We are now in the 9th year of the war, a time of exhaustion and stalemate, where the glory of the initial landing has long since faded into the grinding misery of a siege that refuses to end. The air in the Greek camp is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, rotting garbage, and the sweet, cloying scent of burning fat from the sacrificial altars. This is the setting for the opening of the Iliad. But the poem does not begin with a battle charge. It begins with a plague and a boardroom dispute that spirals into a catastrophe. The camp is dying. Men are coughing up blood, their skin turning black, struck down by an invisible enemy that no shield can block. The soldiers whisper that it is the arrow of Apollo, the god of light and healing, who has turned his bow against them because their high king, Agamemnon, has offended a priest. The pyres are burning day and night, a constant flickering reminder of leadership failing its people, and it is here, amidst the smoke and the coughing, that the fragile alliance between the king who commands the army and the weapon who fights the war finally snaps. The tension has been building for a decade. The friction between Agamemnon, the hereditary monarch who believes he owns the world by right of birth, and Achilles, the meritocratic warlord who knows he owns the battlefield by right of blood. It is a clash of egos that will cost more lives than the Trojans ever could. The explosion happens in a council meeting, a dusty assembly of desperate kings trying to solve the plague. When the truth comes out that Agamemnon must return his own war prize, a girl named Chryseis, to stop the god's wrath, the king lashes out. He cannot bear the public humiliation of losing face, of having fewer possessions than his subordinates. He demands compensation. He looks around the circle of kings, and his eyes land on Achilles. He demands Chryseis. Now, we must pause and strip away the Hollywood varnish from this moment. In the movies, this is often played as a tragic romance, a lover torn from the arms of her soulmate. But the brutal truth of the Bronze Age is far colder. Chryseis was not Achilles' girlfriend in the modern sense. She was his cuirass, his war prize. In the ancient economy of honor, she was a living medal, a tangible proof of his prowess, awarded to him by the army for destroying a city. She was the currency of his reputation. When Agamemnon threatened to take her, he was not just stealing a woman. He was socially castrating Achilles. He was telling the greatest killer in the world that his labor, his risk, and his sacrifice meant absolutely nothing. He was stripping the badges of rank from a general in front of his troops. Historians still argue whether the conflict between Agamemnon and Achilles represents a clash between older, hereditary kingship and a rising class of individualistic warrior meritocracy, or if it is a dramatic device to explore the limits of kingly power. But for Achilles, the insult is existential. He reaches for his sword, his muscles tensing to decapitate the High King right there in the council circle. It is only a moment of divine intervention, a whisper from the goddess Athene, visible only to him. That stays his hand. She promises him that if he waits, if he sheathes his sword, he will be repaid threefold in the future. So, Achilles does something more devastating than killing Agamemnon. He quits. He slams his scepter of authority onto the ground, the wood cracking against the stone, and declares that he is done. He is taking his ball and going home. But this is not a simple resignation. It is a weaponized withdrawal. He knows exactly what he is doing. He knows that without him and the Myrmidons, the Greek line is nothing but a wall of soft flesh against the Trojan iron. He is sentencing thousands of his own allies, men he has eaten with, men he has fought alongside, to death simply to prove a point. The heralds come to his tent to take the girl. It is a quiet, devastating scene. Achilles does not fight them. He hands Briseis over with a terrifying calmness, a cold politeness that is far more unsettling than rage. He watches her go, and with her goes his allegiance to the Greek cause. He retreats into his tent, and a silence falls over the Myrmidon quarter. The ant-men stack their spears. The boars' tusk helmets are hung on posts. The wolves sit down, and then Achilles does the unthinkable. He weeps. He calls out to his mother, Thetis, and demands that she cash in a favor with Zeus. He asks the king of the gods to let the Trojans win. He prays for his own friends to be slaughtered, pushed back to the ships, pinned against the sea, so that Agamemnon will have to crawl through the blood of his own men to beg Achilles to return. It is a prayer of breathtaking narcissism and cruelty. It reveals the dark heart of the hero. He would rather see the world burn than see his own honor tarnished. The consequences are immediate and horrific. The next morning, the Trojans, sensing the absence of the lion, surge forward. Hector, the prince of Troy, realizes the monster is gone and seizes the momentum. The Greek lines crumble. Without the kinetic impact of the Myrmidons to shatter the enemy shield walls, the Greeks are outmatched. Men who had relied on Achilles to protect their flanks now find themselves exposed and terrified. The slaughter is industrial. The river of silence that Achilles has created becomes a vacuum that sucks in Greek lives. And where is Achilles while this happens? He is not pacing anxiously. He is not sharpening his sword. He is sitting in his tent, playing the lyre. The juxtaposition is grotesque. Outside, the air is filled with the screams of dying men, the crash of bronze, and the roar of fire as the Trojans push closer to the ships. Inside, there is the delicate plucking sound of strings and a man singing about the glories of the past. He is watching the genocide of his own army with the detached interest of a god watching a play. He is waiting for the moment when the pain becomes unbearable for Agamemnon, waiting for the apology that will restore his status. This is the menin, the cosmic wrath. It is not a hot, exploding anger. It is a cold, suffocating pressure. It is the rage of a man who believes he is the center of the universe and who is willing to let the universe collapse just to prove he is holding it up. The days turn into a blur of defeat. The Greeks are pushed back to the very edge of the sea, their backs to the black hulls of their ships. The fires of the Trojan camp are so close now that their light flickers on the faces of the terrified Greek sentries. The smell of disaster is everywhere. Agamemnon, broken and panicked, finally breaks. He sends an embassy, Odysseus, Ajax, and Phoenix, to Achilles' tent. They offer him everything: gold, horses, 7 cities, the return of Briseis, and oaths that she was never touched. They beg him to save them. And Achilles, looking them in the eye, says no. He rejects the apology. He rejects the logic of the war. He tells them that death comes to the coward and the brave man alike. So what is the point? He has seen through the hollowness of the hero code. He chooses life. He threatens to sail home the next morning. It is a moment of shocking nihilism. He has deconstructed the entire purpose of their existence. But he does not leave. He stays to watch. He stays because a part of him still craves the fire, even as he denies it. He is hovering on the edge, neither in the war nor out of it, a ghost haunting his own legend. And it is in this paralysis, this refusal to act, that he creates the space for the greatest tragedy of his life to occur. He thinks he is controlling the game, but he has forgotten that in war, chaos is the only true master. The silence in his tent is about to be broken, not by Agamemnon, but by the one person he actually loves, the one person whose death will shatter the last remnants of his restraint and turn the brooding boy into a force of nature. The smell of burning timber is no longer a distant threat. It is a choking reality that fills the lungs of every man on the beach. The Trojans have breached the wall. The first of the black ships, the lifeline home for the Greek army, is engulfed in flames, the fire roaring against the darkening sky like a signal flare of the apocalypse. We are witnessing the moment the war turns from a stalemate into a slaughter. In the tent of Achilles, the silence is finally broken, not by the crash of battle, but by the weeping of Patroclus. He has returned from the medical tents, his tunic stained with the blood of friends he tried to save, his eyes red and swollen. He looks at Achilles, who is still polishing his lyre, still holding on to his grudge like a precious stone, and something in the gentle lieutenant snaps. He calls him hard, a man born not of parents, but of the grey sea and the sheer cliffs, a creature with a heart of stone. It is a desperate, scathing rebuke from the one person Achilles cannot ignore. Patroclus begs for a compromise. If Achilles will not fight, then let him send the Myrmidons. Let him wear Achilles' armor. Let the Trojans see the silhouette of the monster and flee. Achilles agrees, but with a terrifying stipulation. He warns Patroclus to only drive the Trojans from the ships, to not pursue them to the walls of Troy, lest he steal Achilles' glory. It is a command born of possessiveness, not protection. And so, we see the ritual of the dressing. Patroclus puts on the greaves, the breastplate, the heavy bronze helmet with the horsehair crest. He picks up the shield that has terrified a generation. But there is one thing he cannot take: the Pelian ash spear. It stands in the corner, heavy and silent, a reminder that while you can wear the costume of the predator, you cannot borrow his soul. Patroclus takes a lighter spear, leads the Myrmidons out, and the effect is instantaneous. The Trojans, seeing the ant-men pouring into the fray, led by the golden figure of their nightmares, panic. The tide turns. Patroclus fights with a borrowed fury, driving the enemy back, intoxicated by the power of the armor and the adrenaline of the moment. He forgets the warning. He chases the Trojans across the dusty plain, right to the shadow of the Scaean gates. But the brutal truth of the Iliad is that heroism is often a trap. Patroclus is not killed in a fair duel. He is dismantled systematically by the gods and men who envy him. First, Apollo, the protector of Troy, strikes him from behind, knocking the helmet from his head and shattering the spear in his hands. He is left dazed, naked in his vulnerability. Then a lesser Trojan soldier, Euphorbus, stabs him in the back. Finally, Hector, the prince of Troy, finishes the job with a spear thrust to the belly. Patroclus dies, warning Hector that his own death is imminent, but the words are lost in the gurgle of blood. The armor of Achilles is stripped from the body, a supreme insult, and Hector puts it on. The body of Patroclus, now just a piece of meat, becomes the center of a furious brawl, men hacking at each other to drag the corpse into the mud. The news travels back to the Greek camp, not as a rumor, but as a thunderclap. Antilochus, the son of Nestor, runs to Achilles' tent. He does not sugarcoat it. Patroclus is dead. They are fighting over his naked body. Hector has the armor. The reaction of Achilles is not the grief of a man. It is the implosion of a star. He does not cry out immediately. He reaches down with both hands, scoops up the black dust of the hearth, the ashes of the fire, and pours them over his head, defiling his beautiful face, ruining his tunic. He falls to the ground, a massive figure, writhing in the dirt, tearing at his hair with his own hands. The women of the camp, the captives, run out and surround him, wailing. But their grief is nothing compared to the black hole opening in his chest. Historians still argue whether the relationship between Achilles and Patroclus was interpreted by the ancients as a formal pederastic bond or a deep brotherly camaraderie. But in the moment of death, the distinction is irrelevant. Patroclus was the human half of Achilles' soul. He was the anchor that kept the weapon tethered to reality. Without him, Achilles is unmoored. The menin, the rage that had been directed at Agamemnon, now shifts its target. It is no longer a political tool. It is a cosmic force of annihilation. The grief is so intense that his mother, Thetis, hears his cry from the depths of the sea and comes to him. She finds him holding the body of his friend, his hands stained with the blood and dust. She tells him that if he kills Hector, he will die shortly after. Achilles looks at her with dead eyes and says, "Then let me die immediately." He has no interest in a life without his other half. The choice he made on Scyros is now being called in. But he has no armor. Hector is wearing it. The sun is setting, and the Trojans are close to dragging Patroclus's body away to mutilate it. Achilles cannot fight yet, but he can do something else. He walks to the trench that separates the Greek camp from the plain. He stands there, naked of armor, but Athena throws her own aegis, a tessellated shield of storm and terror, around his shoulders. A flame, described as a golden cloud of fire, bursts from his head, reaching up to the heavens. He is a lighthouse of pure hate. He takes a breath and lets out a roar. It is not a battle cry. It is a sound that has no language, a primal scream of loss and fury that vibrates in the marrow of every living thing on the plain. The text tells us that the sound was so terrifying that the Trojan horses reared up and 12 of their best warriors died on the spot, impaled on their own spears or trampled in the panic, just from the sound of his voice. The Trojans fall back, terrified by this unarmed demon glowing in the twilight. The Greeks use the confusion to drag Patroclus's body back to safety. Achilles follows the corpse back to his tent. He cleans the wounds, weeping over the cold flesh. He vows to Patroclus that he will not bury him until he has brought the head of Hector and the severed heads of 12 Trojan princes to the funeral pyre. It is a promise of human sacrifice. The man who played the lyre is gone. The man who sat in the tent is gone. In his place is something cold, empty, and infinitely dangerous. He refuses to eat. He refuses to wash the blood and ash from his skin. He wants to become a dead man walking, to bridge the gap between himself and Patroclus by acting as if he is already in the underworld. The Greeks look at him with fear now, not just respect. They see that he has crossed a line. He is no longer fighting for victory. He is fighting to hurt the world that took his friend. The night falls heavy and suffocating over the camp, but there is no sleep for Achilles. He stands by the body, his hand resting on the cold chest of his companion, waiting for the dawn. And when the sun rises, it will not bring light. It will bring a darkness that will swallow the river, the city, and the last remnants of his own humanity. The river of silence is about to become a river of blood, and the gods themselves will have to step in to stop the slaughter. The dawn that breaks over the Trojan plain is not the rosy-fingered dawn of the poets. It is a grey, sickly light that struggles to penetrate the smoke of the pyres. But for the Trojans standing on the ramparts, the sun is not the brightest thing on the horizon. Emerging from the Greek lines is a figure that shines with a terrifying, supernatural luminosity. Achilles has returned, clad in armor forged not by a mortal smith, but by the god Hephaestus himself. The shield he bears is a microcosm of the universe, depicting cities in peace and war, the stars, the ocean, and the rhythms of harvest. A cruel irony, for he carries the image of the entire living world into battle solely to destroy it. He does not march. He flows like a landslide, and the Greeks give him a wide berth. Terrified of the heat radiating from his rage. He is no longer fighting for prizes, for Briseis, or for Agamemnon. He has entered a state of aristia, a moment of godlike dominance that has curdled into something industrial and grotesque. He is not looking for a duel. He is looking for an extermination. The Trojan army, caught in the open, shatters upon contact. Achilles acts as a wedge, driving half the army toward the city, and the other half into the steep banks of the river Scamander. It is here, in the muddy, reeds-choked bends of the river, that the war turns into a horror movie. Achilles leaps into the water, armed only with his sword, leaving his spear on the bank. What follows is described in the Iliad with a repetitive, rhythmic brutality that mimics the swinging of a scythe. He chops and slashes until the water, once a clear, flowing life source for the region, turns into a sluggish slurry of crimson. The text tells us the Trojans huddled under the banks like small fish fleeing a dolphin, paralyzed by the sheer efficiency of the predator in their midst. There is no strategy here, only the mechanics of slaughter. He kills so many men that the river physically stops flowing, its channel dammed by a wall of tangled limbs, bronze cuirasses, and floating hair. In the midst of this carnage, a moment of profound psychological horror occurs, a moment that defines the brutal truth of Achilles' new reality. He encounters a young Trojan prince named Lycaon. This is not their first meeting. Achilles had captured the boy years ago while he was cutting branches in an orchard and sold him into slavery. Lycaon had ransomed himself, returned to Troy, and enjoyed only 11 days of freedom before falling back into Achilles' hands. The boy, naked and unarmed, grasps Achilles' knees, the universal gesture of the suppliant, and begs for his life. He appeals to economics, promising a huge ransom. In the old world, the world before Patroclus died, Achilles would have taken the money. It was the rational, civilized thing to do. But the man standing over him is no longer rational. Achilles looks down at the boy with a terrifying, empty gentleness and delivers a speech of chilling nihilism. He tells Lycaon not to complain, for even Patroclus died, and Patroclus was a far better man than he. He points to his own divine beauty, his own power, and says, "Look at me. Even I will die. There will be a dawn or a sunset where someone will take my life. So why should you be spared? Die, my friend, die." It is the "my friend" that twists the knife. He kills the boy not out of anger, but out of a dark camaraderie of the doomed. He sees death as the only reality, and he is simply ushering Lycaon into the inevitable. He tosses the body into the river, telling the fish to lick the blood from his wound, denying him a burial. This desecration of the natural order triggers a response from the land itself. The river Scamander, the god known to the gods as Xanthus, rises up. This is not a metaphor. In the animistic worldview of the Bronze Age, the landscape was alive, and the river is furious. Not because of the morality of the war, but because it is literally choking on the meat Achilles is feeding it. The river speaks, a gurgling, deep voice rising from the eddies, begging Achilles to stop clogging its beautiful channels with corpses. Achilles, in his madness, agrees to stop filling the river, but refuses to stop killing the Trojans. He leaps back in, and the river attacks. Historians and literary scholars still debate whether this scene represents a hallucination of a warrior in the throes of PTSD, fighting the very elements, or a memory of a flash flood that actually occurred during a battle on the Trojan plain. But in the narrative, It is a wrestle between a man and a force of nature. The river swells, dark waves crashing over Achilles' head, beating against his shield, dragging him under. The hero who cannot be killed by men is almost drowned by water. It is a chaotic, swirling nightmare of mud and foam. Achilles screams at the sky, not in fear of death, but in anger at the lack of glory, in drowning like a pighead in a storm. He clutches at elm trees on the bank, uprooting them in his desperation, bridging the stream. The water chases him across the plain, a terrifying image of nature trying to purge the virus of human violence from its surface. It takes the intervention of Hephaestus, the god of fire, to save him. A massive, supernatural firestorm descends, boiling the river, burning the corpses, and turning the plain into a steaming cauldron. The elements of water and fire clash over the tiny, raging figure of the man, until the river finally yields, shrinking back into its bed, exhausted and scalded. Achilles emerges from the steam, wet, muddy, and steaming, looking less like a hero and more like a demon birthed from the earth. He has fought an army, he has debated philosophy with a victim, and he has wrestled a god. And he is still not tired. His chest heaves, but his eyes are fixed on the one prize that matters. The river was just an obstacle. The army was just chaff. The real target is still out there, standing alone by the Scaean gates. The rest of the Trojans have fled inside the walls, the heavy timber doors slamming shut behind them like the lid of a coffin. But one man remains outside, Hector. He stands there, shackled by his own pride and the weight of his mistakes, waiting for the storm to arrive. Achilles begins to run across the steaming plain, his armor clattering with a sound that spells the end of an age. He is not running to win a war. He is running to end a story. The distance between them closes, meter by bloody meter, and the silence of the city watching from the walls is the silence of a held breath before the executioner's axe falls. The river of blood is behind him, but the ocean of grief is still ahead, and it is deep enough to drown the world. The camp is silent under the heavy blanket of night, a silence that feels fragile, as if the very air is holding its breath in anticipation of a scream. In the tent of Achilles, the atmosphere is oppressive, thick with the smell of stale wine and the metallic linger of blood. The hero sits alone, as he always does now, a figure carved from grief and stone. The body of Patroclus has finally been burned, his white bones gathered in a golden urn, but the rage has not burned out with the pyre. It has settled into a cold, hard knot in Achilles' chest. He is a man who has completed his mission. He has killed the enemy, avenged his friend, and won the war in all but name. Yet he remains awake, staring into the dark, waiting for a peace that refuses to come. And then, the impossible happens. The door flap of his tent, heavy with wool, is pushed aside. An old man enters. He is cloaked in dark robes, moving with the trembling hesitation of age, but his eyes carry a desperate, piercing clarity. It is Priam, the king of Troy. He has crossed the enemy lines alone, guided by the god Hermes, passing through the sleeping Greek army like a ghost, driven by a father's love that outweighs his fear of death. He does not stand on ceremony. He does not announce his rank. The king of the East falls to his knees in the dirt of the tent floor. He reaches out with wrinkled, trembling hands, hands that have held scepters and poured libations to unresponsive gods, and he grasps the knees of the man who murdered his sons. And then he does the unthinkable. He kisses those hands. The text of the Iliad pauses here, as if the universe itself is shocked by the gesture. Priam kisses the terrible, man-slaughtering hands of Achilles. It is an act of absolute, crushing humility. It is the moment the cycle of violence is interrupted by a radical act of grace. Priam looks up at the face of the monster and speaks. "Think of your father, O Achilles," he whispers. "He is an old man like me, standing on the sad threshold of old age. But at least he has the hope that you are still alive. I have no such hope. I had 50 sons, and you have killed the best of them. I have done what no other man on earth has done. I have brought my lips to the hand of the man who killed my child." The words strike Achilles with the force of a physical blow. The mention of Peleus, the father he abandoned, the father he will never see again, cracks the armor around his heart. For the first time since Patroclus died, the menin, the cosmic wrath, dissolves. It is replaced by a sudden, overwhelming wave of human sorrow. He looks at Priam and sees not a king, not an enemy, but a mirror of his own father's future grief. He realizes, with a jolt of clarity, that he is the architect of this old man's pain, just as he will be the architect of his own father's suffering when the news of his death eventually reaches Pythia. The connection is electric and profound. The two enemies, the young killer and the old king, begin to weep together. They are not weeping for the war or for glory. They are weeping for the universal tragedy of the human condition, for the fact that we are all soft, mortal things destined to lose what we love. The sound of their grief fills the tent, a strange, dissonant harmony of moans. Achilles gently pushes the old man away, not in rejection, but in recognition of their shared space. He stands up and raises Priam to his feet. He admires the old man's courage. "You have a heart of iron," he says, but this time he means it as a compliment. In this quiet, candlelit moment, Achilles reclaims his humanity. The beast recedes. He orders his serving women to wash and wrap the body of Hector, doing it out of sight, so that Priam will not see the mutilated state of his son and lash out in anger, which might provoke Achilles to kill him and break the truce. Even in his mercy, Achilles knows his own volatility. He understands that the wolf is still inside him, sleeping lightly. He lifts Hector's body onto the wagon himself, a final act of respect to a worthy opponent. He then invites Priam to eat. They break bread together, two men sitting at the end of the world, finding a common ground in their need for sustenance and their shared mortality. Achilles grants Priam a truce of 11 days for the funeral of Hector, promising to hold back the Greek army. He knows with a terrifying certainty that on the 12th day, the killing will start again. He knows that he will die soon after. But for these 11 days, there will be peace. This is the true climax of the story. It is not the death of Hector, but the resurrection of Achilles' soul. He has moved from a state of subhuman rage to a state of suprahuman compassion. He has looked into the face of the enemy and seen himself. As Priam leaves in the pre-dawn light, driving the cart with his son's body back to Troy, Achilles watches him go. He is alone again, but the silence is different now. It is no longer the silence of the void. It is the silence of acceptance. He goes to sleep, finally, next to Briseis, the woman who started the quarrel, but she is no longer a trophy. She is just a warm body in the dark. The war will consume him. The arrow of Paris is waiting in the future, guided by Apollo to the one spot the fire didn't touch. But in this moment, Achilles has achieved a victory greater than any sack of a city. He has conquered his own nature. He has learned, at the very end of his short, burning life, that empathy requires more courage than violence. The sun rises over the camp, and for the first time in weeks, the river flows clear, the birds sing, and the man in the tent is just a man, waiting for the end with his eyes wide open. The truce of 11 days dissolves into the smoke of the 12th dawn, and the machinery of war grinds back into motion with a weary, inevitable groan. The pause for Hector's funeral was a brief intake of breath, a moment of suspended animation. But now, the lungs of the conflict are exhaling fire once more. Achilles returns to the field, but he moves with a different energy. The manic, river-choking rage has been replaced by a cold, fatalistic determination. He knows the clock is ticking. His mother, Thetis, had told him that his death would follow Hector's swiftly, and Achilles is not a man to run from a deadline. He fights now, not to change the outcome, but to meet it. He drives the Trojans back to the Scaean gates, his spear flashing like lightning, his armor, the work of Hephaestus, deflecting every blow. He is the unstoppable force, the apex predator, the golden lion of the Greeks. But the brutal truth of war is that it does not respect narrative arcs or poetic justice. The death of the greatest warrior who ever lived does not come in a clash of titans. It does not come from the blade of a worthy rival like Aeneas or Memnon. It comes from the shadows, from a distance, delivered by the man Achilles despises most. Paris, Paris, the prince who prefers the bow to the spear, the lover who stole Helen and started the fire that is burning the world, stands on the ramparts of Troy. He is not a hero in the Greek sense. He is an archer, a sniper, someone who kills without risking his own skin. He draws his bow, the wood groaning under the tension, and releases an arrow. But this is not just a piece of wood and bronze flying through the air. The god Apollo, the protector of Troy, who has never forgiven Achilles for his arrogance, guides the shaft. It flies true, bypassing the divine breastplate, the heavy greaves, and the shield that contains the cosmos. It strikes the one place where the armor does not reach, the one place where the human body is structurally vulnerable to a catastrophic drop in mobility. The heel. Historians still argue whether the myth of the Achilles heel, the idea that he was physically invulnerable everywhere else due to the river Styx, is a later invention by Roman poets or a genuine piece of lost Greek folklore. But in the grim reality of Bronze Age combat, the specific vulnerability matters less than the tactical result. An arrow through the ankle tendon destroys a man's ability to stand. The great tower of muscle and bronze collapses. Achilles falls in the dust, not because he was outfought, but because he was hamstrung. It is a cheap, dirty death. He tries to pull the arrow out, but the barb holds. The Trojans, seeing the monster fall, rush forward like a pack of jackals. A chaotic, desperate scrimmage erupts over his fallen body, similar to the one over Patroclus. It is Ajax, the giant, who finally shields the body, carrying Achilles back to the ships while Odysseus holds back the enemy. The greatest life of the age ends in a muddy scramble, a confused shouting match in the dirt. The funeral of Achilles is a spectacle that rivals the war itself. The Greeks cut their hair in mourning, a sea of shorn heads bowing in grief. Thetis and her sea-nymph sisters rise from the waves, their wailing joining the cries of the army. a sound so unearthly that the soldiers tremble in their boots. They build a pyre that consumes entire forests of timber. And when the flames finally die down, they do the one thing that Achilles had asked for, the one thing that provides a glimmer of comfort in this bleak narrative. They take his white bones, now purified by fire, and they mix them in a golden urn with the bones of Patroclus. The two men, separated by death, are physically united in the earth. They are buried under a massive tumulus on the headland of the Hellespont, a mound so high that it can be seen by sailors passing by for centuries to come. It is a monument to glory, a physical manifestation of the kleos Achilles traded his life for. But the story does not end in the grave. The most devastating, brutal truth comes years later, in a sequel that deconstructs the entire premise of the hero's journey. In the Odyssey, Odysseus travels to the underworld to seek guidance from the dead. There, in the gloom of Hades, he encounters the ghost of Achilles. The meeting is tense. Odysseus, ever the diplomat, tries to comfort the fallen hero. He praises Achilles, telling him that he is blessed, for he was honored like a god while he lived, and now he rules as a mighty prince among the dead. He tries to validate the choice Achilles made, the short life for eternal glory. Achilles' response is the single most important passage in the entire epic cycle. It shatters the romanticism of war forever. The ghost looks at Odysseus with hollow eyes and says, "Do not speak to me soothingly about death, glorious Odysseus. I would rather be a paid servant in a poor man's house, a landless peasant who has little to eat, than be king of all these dead." Let those words sink in. The man who chose death over life, who sacrificed everything for fame, who burned the world to ensure his name would be remembered, now admits it was a mistake. He would trade all his statues, all his songs, all his glory, just to be a nobody who can feel the sun on his face and taste a piece of bread. He realizes, too late, that the simple act of living, of breathing, of eating, of holding a hand, is worth more than all the honor in the world. This is the final tragedy of Achilles. He is not a hero to be emulated. He is a warning to be heeded. He represents the seductive, dangerous lie that violence brings meaning. He spent his life trying to become something more than human, dipped in fire, fed on marrow, armored by gods, only to discover, in the dark silence of the afterlife, that his humanity was the only thing of value he ever possessed. The ant-men are gone. The armor is rusted. The city of Troy is a burnt ruin. All that remains is the whisper of a ghost who wishes he had chosen the quiet life. The legacy of Achilles is not the glory of the kill. It is the grief of the realization that life, no matter how ordinary, is the only true miracle. We leave him there, in the shadows, a king of nothing, while we, the living, turn back toward the light, carrying his secret with us. The war is over. The voice of the poet fades, and the only sound left is the gentle, rhythmic lapping of the waves against the shore, washing away the footprints of the heroes, leaving the sand smooth and clean once more. And now, the fires of the Bronze Age have finally burned down to cool grey ash. The shouting of the captains and the clash of the shields have faded into the deep, forgiving silence of history. The great walls of Troy are just stones beneath the grass, and the ships have long since sailed home or rotted into the sea. We can step back from the edge of the trench now. We can leave the ghosts to their rest. The anger of Achilles That cosmic rage that shook the foundations of the world has quieted into a story we tell in the dark, a lesson whispered across the centuries. Take a deep breath. Let the heavy metallic air of the battlefield be replaced by the soft, cool air of your own room. Feel the weight of your own body, safe and warm, far away from the sharp bronze and the hungry fire. You are here, in the gentle present, where life is not a war to be won, but a quiet moment to be enjoyed. The heroes have done their work. They have carried the burden so you don't have to. The night is yours now. It is a time for peace, for the slow, steady rhythm of your own heart, beating a lullaby of safety. Let the darkness wrap around you, not as a shroud, but as a comfort. Close your eyes. Let the river of time flow past you, smooth and calm. Sweet dreams.